Now let's take some time to look at the work of Carleton Watkins. Carleton Watkins was a commercial photographer. His studio was based in San Francisco. That's where he worked out of. He's known for aesthetically adapting the conventions of landscape painting as it was popular among American audiences of his time. He's known for what they called the mammoth camera, an enormous camera, custom built, that shot to 18 by 22-inch glass plate negatives. He's well known for his photographs of what would become Yosemite National Park. It was just a region of California at the time. It wasn't a park yet, but his photographs were instrumental in convincing the government to make it a national park. The story that his photographs tell of Yosemite, they present it as an Eden that is undisrupted by human intervention. He's also known for later work that he did in the state of Oregon, photographing areas that did include human intervention, and he presented it as what came to be called a commercial sublime, that reflected that human action did not disrupt the majesty of nature, but rather worked pretty well with it. So this is the sort of painting that we're talking about when we talk about the painting styles that Watkins emulated. So this is a painting by Albert Bierstadt. That's the kind of painting that would have toured in the United States when these paintings were made. They were big and they were tremendously impressive, and people would wait in line to have a turn to sit on a lovely bench and just be able to sit and contemplate these paintings when they were first made. These photographs show you just how big that 18 by 22-inch plate mammoth camera was. So Watkins, here played by an actor, would have had to haul this camera around on a wagon, a horse-drawn or mule-drawn wagon. It took a lot of labor and multiple assistants to work with this kind of a camera, but the photographs that he got from it were extraordinary. So this is typical of the kinds of photographs that Carlton Watkins made in Yosemite. They were first exhibited in 1862, and then in 1863, these photographs were put in front of Lincoln, who was easily persuaded to take the steps to conserve this area and protect it from mining and American settling interests. In this view of Yosemite, you can see that he's structured it so that there's water closer to our vantage point, mountains in the distance. You get a clear sense of foreground, middle ground, and background, and the composition of all of it is very much like one of these spectacular paintings that people loved so much. This photograph he entitled Yosemite Valley from the Best General View. In this composition, you can see he's framed it so that there's a tree in the foreground that is so tall that the top of the tree is even cut off by the edge of the frame. Okay, when we're thinking about Sarkowski's ideas about the frame and how the frame creates the picture, this gives such a persuasive sense of the vastness of the landscape itself and of even the trees that you find in this part of the country. He's framed it so that the valley extends from right where our vantage point is. Okay, you can see that we're right at the edge of a bluff. And you see this sort of dramatic fall off there, and then there's this valley beneath us, and you can see the waterfalls to the right. The valley meanders off into the distance where there's sort of an atmospheric perspective. You know, there's a sort of softening and lightening of the details off in the background that enhance that feeling of depth of the whole thing. And there are specific features of the Yosemite landscape, which already went by names like the Three Brothers and El Capitan. And the named features of the landscape are brought together in this best general view. This is a photograph that they pay some attention to in our book as really demonstrating Carleton Watkins' strategies and skills as a photographer. You can see that he chose a particular time of day to photograph this rock, this landscape feature, because the shadows of the tree that are falling across this rock in front of us help to separate it from the background and the falls that you see off in the distance. If you look at the lights and darks of the photographs, he's using the lights and shadows to enhance the sort of modeling and three-dimensional quality of the rock and to make it stand out from its background. Here's a comparison of two different views of similar rocks, just so that you can see different strategies that he takes in his photographs. On the left, you see a strategy that's a little bit more like what you see in Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs, where he's including individual people. He's including the human element to give a sense of scale. Without that human element, it's really difficult to have that sense of scale. Okay, so if you look at the way that he's photographed it on the right, there are no human beings there in the foreground of the image on the right, although there's evidence of human habitation off in the distance. It's very, very subtle, and it doesn't give us that sense of scale. Without those scale markers, we don't know how big this rock is, and the rocks and the trees, they have more of a sense of vastness and less of a sense of being concrete and sort of a scale that we can mentally be specific about and sort of mentally nail down. So there are different strategies to create the effect that he wants in the photograph. Carlton Watkins was absolutely entranced with the trees of this region of California. So these mammoth scale trees that he photographed in the Mariposa Grove, um, to communicate the scale of the trees was he tried a number of different strategies just so that the people who saw these photographs would be able to begin to grasp just how vast these trees truly are. It's very difficult to fit one of these trees into a photograph because it's a forest, and to get the camera far enough away to be able to get these enormous trees into the photograph, you end up getting other things in the way. So that's a challenge in itself. But one thing that he did in this photograph is, again, he's got people in there for scale markers. And if you look way down at the base of this tree that they called the grizzly giant, you can see the little tiny human figures down at the bottom of the tree. And without those human figures in there, people looking at this photograph literally would not believe just how vast these trees truly are. Another strategy that Carlton Watkins deployed, but very, very rarely, there are a few of these photographs out there, was turning his camera upward. Now you can't turn the Mammoth View camera upward, but there were smaller cameras that he was able to angle so that he could capture a photograph shooting upward towards the top of the trees. It's the kind of thing that we take for granted now and that became very easy with the handheld cameras that would be invented later. But Watkins didn't have one of those. He had to make special modifications to his cameras to be able to shoot upwards and capture that view looking up at the tops of the trees. This photograph represents the sort of work that he did later on in Oregon, showing and really foregrounding the railroads and the evidence of the roads and the mining and the settlements that were going in Oregon. And he frames them in such a way that they look as dramatic and elegant as the landscape features that they're combined with. Carleton Watkins made many stereo views. This was a way that middle class people all over the country could collect his photographs as they collected other views of distant locations that they would like to be able to imagine traveling to. So this kind of stereoscope would have been pretty inexpensive, and it was very, very commonplace for people to have these around, whether their collection of stereo views themselves was big or small. It was very common to have these viewers. This is the kind of camera that Carleton Watkins would have used to capture his stereo views. As you can see, there are two lenses on the camera, so they're capturing views that are captured from vantage points in the camera that are just as far apart from each other as your eyes are on your head, so that when those pictures are taken, they're taken from slightly different angles, and then through the viewer, your eyes and your perceptive field sort of merge them together to a three-dimensional view. So stereo views were widespread for documentation of important events and sites out there in the world. Stereo views were also popular for sort of novelty subject matter, like this one that's just sort of a visual joke, a joke on the stereo view itself. So you see a man who's being visited by the stereo view seller, and he's like putting one card after another in front of the man who's like, oh, look at that, looking at his stereo viewer. He's completely oblivious to what the stereo view seller is doing with his wife. So here's Carleton Watkins' best general view from Mariposa Trail as presented in a stereo view. And you can see that the way that he's composed it in the stereo camera, which of course is, it's a separate camera from that mammoth camera, he's composed it in the same way so that the top of the tree is cropped off by the edge of the framing, still communicating that sense of vastness and depth. So Carleton Watkins sold his photographs as prints to the general public. So he wanted to use that sublime aesthetic, that sense of overwhelm and drama, balancing the sublime and the beautiful, the stuff that people just loved in pictures. So he's putting that into photographs to sell the photographs. And he put that strategically to work in convincing the government to preserve Yosemite. He also made every effort to sell these to the American public, was not so successful at making a living selling the photographs themselves, but he really did his best. So once he lost his business, that business was taken over by another photographer who, as you can see by this stereo view here, put his own brand on the photographs that Carleton Watkins had taken.